Alrighty, and hello again. We are about to go live with Sense and Sensibility from chapter 22. I think I got up to yesterday, chapter 22 onwards. I am just copying and sharing this one to places which I need to go. Uh, okay. I've been through and done a bit more pre-editing this time for chapters, so hopefully I won't have to stop to do corrections today, because that was a bit of a hassle yesterday. Some of these are quite long chapters. So, and with quite a lot of narrator parts. I saw there's at least one which I'm thinking is probably going to be 20 minutes worth. But we shall see. We shall see how we go. Everything's switched on there. Everything's switched on here. I'm transmitting with sound. Okay. Oh, lip balm. That would help before I start with dry lips. All right, and away we go. If you haven't seen the introduction, I'll just give you a quick recap. Basically, this is for a radio play style of audiobook, which is multicast. I am only reading the narrator parts. All dialogue and other character voices will be cut in later. As I said, there's quite a lot of it, but yeah, you won't get the whole story. You're welcome to pick up a copy of Sense and Sensibility and read along. It has been lightly edited to just, give people clearer dialogue parts, remove too many attributions, that sort of thing. But yet you won't hear the full book here. That will be out on Audible in a couple of months. Everyone else has done all their parts. We're all due by the end of May. I'm trying to get the majority of mine done by the end of April, because as the narrator, I have the most work to do, the most actual words to read. All right, chapter 23. Let's get going. Chapter 23. Marianne, who had never had much toleration for anything like impertinence, vulgarity, inferiority of parts, or even difference of taste from herself, was at this time particularly ill-disposed, from the state of her spirits, to be pleased with the Miss Steeles, or to encourage their advances, and to the invariable coldness of her behaviour towards them, which checked every endeavour at intimacy on their side, Eleanor principally attributed that preference of herself which soon became evident in the manners of both, but especially of Lucy, who missed no opportunity of engaging her in conversation, or of striving to improve their acquaintance by an easy and frank communication of her sentiments. Lucy was naturally clever. Her remarks were often just and amusing, and as a companion for half an hour, Eleanor frequently found her agreeable, but her powers had received no aid from education. She was ignorant and illiterate, and her deficiency of all mental improvement, her want of information in the most common particulars, could not be concealed from Miss Dashwood, in spite of her constant endeavour to appear to advantage. Eleanor saw, and pitied her for, the neglect of abilities which education might have rendered so respectable, but she saw with less tenderness of feeling the thorough want of delicacy, of rectitude, and integrity of mind, which her attentions, her assiduities, her flatteries at the park betrayed. And she could have no lasting satisfaction in the company of a person who joined insincerity with ignorance, whose want of instruction prevented their meeting in conversation on terms of equality, and whose conduct toward others made every show of attention and deference towards herself. Now, I'm running out of breath. I'm getting higher and higher. These sentences are so long. Running out of breath and my pitch is changing. I go back and redo that sentence with the proper breath in me. That was 3 really long ones in a row. Whew. Okay, try again. Eleanor saw, and pitied her for, the neglect of abilities which education might have rendered so respectable, but she saw with less tenderness of feeling the thorough want of delicacy, of rectitude, and integrity of mind, which her attentions, her assiduities, her flatteries at the park betrayed. And she could have no lasting satisfaction in the company of a person who joined insincerity with ignorance, whose want of instruction prevented their meeting in conversation on terms of equality, and whose conduct toward others made every show of attention and deference towards herself perfectly valueless, said Lucy to her one day, as they were walking together from the park to the cottage. Eleanor did think the question a very odd one, and her countenance expressed it, as she answered that she had never seen Mrs. Ferrars. Returned Eleanor, cautious of giving her real opinion of Edward's mother, and not very desirous of satisfying what seemed impertinent curiosity. Said Lucy, eyeing Eleanor attentively as she spoke. Oh, damn, there is one I've just missed there. Rats. Hey, that's an embedded line I've just missed. I'm just going to put it in. Oh, blast. Okay, so that line is for the narrator, and that line is for Lucy Steele. Oh, why would my computer put in so many C's there? Do not want that many. Okay. Attentively as she spoke, Eleanor made her a civil reply, and they walked on for a few minutes in silence. It was broken by Lucy, who renewed the subject again by saying, with some hesitation, said Eleanor, in great astonishment. She looked down as she said this, amiably bashful, with only one side glance at her companion to observe its effect on her. The buzzing sound. Okay, I think I could stop it, whatever that was. And she did not feel much delighted with the idea of such a sister-in-law. Fixing her eyes upon Eleanor. What felt Eleanor at that moment? Astonishment that would have been as painful as it was strong, had not an immediate disbelief of the assertion attended it. She turned towards Lucy in silent amazement, unable to divine the reason or object of such a declaration, and though her complexion varied, she stood firm in incredulity, and felt in no danger of an hysterical fit or a swoon. She paused. Eleanor for a few moments remained silent. Her assertion was too great for words, but at length, forcing herself to speak, and to speak cautiously, she said, with calmness of manner, which tolerably well concealed her surprise and solicitude. Eleanor, though greatly shocked, still felt unable to believe it. Replied Eleanor, with an exertion of spirits, which increased with her increase of emotion. Answered Eleanor, without knowing what she said, but after a moment's reflection, she added, with revived security of Edward's honour and love, and her companion's falsehood. Lucy smiled. Replied Eleanor, in a most painful perplexity. She was silent. Eleanor's security sunk, but her self-command did not sink with it. Then, taking a small miniature from her pocket, she added, She put it into her hands as she spoke, and when Eleanor saw the painting, whatever other doubts her fear of a too hasty decision or her wish of detecting falsehood might suffer to linger in her mind, she could have none of its being Edward's face. She returned it almost instantly, acknowledging the likeness. Replied Eleanor calmly. They then proceeded. As she said this, she looked earnestly at Lucy, hoping to discover something in her countenance, perhaps the falsehood of the greatest part of what she had been saying, but Lucy's countenance suffered no change. One moment, where is it? Here she took out her handkerchief, but Eleanor did not feel very compassionate. Continued Lucy, after wiping her eyes. As she said this, she looked directly at her companion. Replied Eleanor, startled by the question. Continued Lucy, after a few minutes' silence on both sides. Replied Eleanor, feeling, most feelingly sensible, not feeling most sensible. Distracted by yet another error. This is driving me bananas. Replied Eleanor, most feelingly sensible of every fresh circumstance in favour of Lucy's veracity. She remembered, too, her own surprise at the time at his mentioning nothing farther of those friends, at his total silence with respect even to their names. Repeated Lucy, taking a letter from her pocket and carelessly showing the direction to Eleanor. Eleanor saw that it was his hand, and she could doubt no longer. This picture, she had allowed herself to believe, might have been accidentally obtained. It might not have been Edward's gift, but a correspondence between them by letter could subsist only under a positive engagement, could be authorized by nothing else. For a few moments she was almost overcome. Her heart sunk within her, and she could hardly stand. But exertion was indispensably necessary, and she struggled so resolutely against the oppression of her feelings that her success was speedy and for the time complete. Said Lucy, returning the letter into her pocket. Said Eleanor, with a composure of voice under which was concealed an emotion and distress beyond anything she had ever felt before. She was mortified, shocked, confounded. Fortunately for her, they had now reached the cottage, and the conversation could be continued no farther. After sitting with them a few minutes, the Miss Steeles returned to the park, and Ellen... No. Try it again. No farther. After sitting with them a few minutes, the Miss Steeles returned to the park, and Eleanor was then at liberty to think and be wretched. I'd forgotten what a horrible little Madam Lucy Steele was. Okay. All right, and that is chapter 22. Wrapped and recorded. And now backed up to the cloud. 8 minutes, 35 seconds. All right, write that on my board. Save. Okay, next. Chapter 23. However small Eleanor's general dependence on Lucy's veracity might be, it was impossible for her, on serious reflection, to suspect it in the present case, where no temptation could be answerable to the folly of inventing a falsehood of such a description. What Lucy had asserted to be true, therefore, Eleanor could not, dared not longer doubt, supported as it was too on every side by such probabilities and proofs, and contradicted by nothing but her own wishes. Their opportunity of acquaintance in the house of Mr. Pratt was a foundation for the rest, at once indisputable and alarming, and Edward's visit near Plymouth, his melancholy state of mind, his dissatisfaction at his own prospects, his uncertain behaviour towards herself, the intimate knowledge of the Miss Steeles as to Norland and their family connections, which had often surprised her, the picture, the letter, the ring, formed altogether such a body of evidence as overcame every fear of condemning him unfairly, and established as a fact, which no partiality could set aside, his ill treatment of herself. Her resentment of such behaviour, her indignation at having been its dupe, for a short time made her feel only for herself, but other ideas, other considerations, soon arose. Had Edward been intentionally deceiving her? Had he feigned a regard for her which he did not feel? Was his engagement to Lucy an engagement of the heart? No, whatever it might once have been, she could not believe it such at present. His affection was all her own. She could not be deceived in that. Her mother, sisters, Fanny, all had been conscious of his regard for her at Norland. It was not an illusion of her own vanity. He certainly loved her. What a softener of the heart was this persuasion! How much could it not tempt her to forgive? He had been blamable, highly blamable, in remaining at Norland after he first felt her influence over him to be more than it ought to be. In that he could not be defended, but if he had injured her, how much more had he injured himself? If her case were pitiable, his was hopeless. His imprudence had made her miserable for a while, but it seemed to have deprived himself of all chance of ever being otherwise. She might in time regain tranquillity, but he, what had he to look forward to? Could he ever be tolerably happy with Lucy Steele? Could he, were his affection for herself out of the question, with his integrity, his delicacy, and well-informed mind, be satisfied with a wife like her, illiterate, artful, and selfish? The youthful infatuation of 19 would naturally blind him to everything but her. 4 succeeding years, years which, if rationally spent, give such improvement to the understanding, must have opened his eyes to her defects of education, while the same period of time, spent on her side in inferior society and more frivolous pursuits, had perhaps robbed her of that simplicity which might once have given an interesting character to her beauty. If, in the supposition of his seeking to marry herself, his difficulties from his mother had seemed great, how much greater were they now likely to be, when the object of his engagement was undoubtedly inferior in connections, and probably inferior in fortune to herself? These difficulties, indeed, with a heart so alienated from Lucy, might not press very hard upon his patience, but melancholy was the state of a person by whom the expectation of family opposition and unkindness could be felt as a relief. As these considerations occurred to her in painful succession, she wept for him, more than for herself. Supported by the conviction of having done nothing to merit her present unhappiness, and consoled by the belief that Edward had done nothing to forfeit her esteem, she thought she could, even now, under the first smart of the heavy blow, command herself enough to guard every suspicion of the truth from her mother and sisters. And so well was she able to answer her own expectations, that when she joined them at dinner, only 2 hours after she had first suffered the extinction of all her dearest hopes. No one would have supposed from the appearance of the sisters that Eleanor was mourning in secret over obstacles which must divide her forever from the object of her love, and that Marianne was internally dwelling on the perfections of a man of whose whole heart she felt thoroughly possessed, and whom she expected to see in every carriage which drove near their house. The necessity of concealing from her mother and Marianne what had been entrusted in confidence to herself, though it obliged her to unceasing exertion, was no aggravation of Eleanor's distress. On the contrary, it was a relief to her to be spared the communication of what would give such affliction to them, and to be saved likewise from hearing that condemnation of Edward, which would probably flow from the excess of their partial affection for herself, and which was more than she felt equal to support. From their counsel or their conversation, she knew she could receive no assistance. Oh, my stomach just burbled. Whoops. Oh, that's okay. I did very well in that first take, over 5 minutes. I know this is one of the longer chapters, so I want to kind of get into it, get through as much as I can. Hearing that sound, I don't know what that is. From their counsel or their conversation, she knew she could receive no assistance. Their tenderness and sorrow must add to her distress, while her self-command would neither receive encouragement from their example nor from their praise. She was stronger alone, and her own good sense so well supported her that her firmness was as unshaken, her appearance of cheerfulness as invariable, as with regrets so poignant and so fresh it was possible for them to be. Much as she had suffered from her first conversation with Lucy on the subject, she soon felt an earnest wish of renewing it, and this for more reasons than one. She wanted to hear many particulars of their engagement repeated again. She wanted more clearly to understand what Lucy really felt for Edward, whether there were any sincerity in her declaration of tender regard for him, and she particularly wanted to convince Lucy, by her readiness to enter on the matter again, and her calmness in conversing on it, that she was no otherwise interested in it than as a friend, which she very much feared her involuntary agitation in their morning discourse from her venturing to trust her on so short a personal acquaintance with a secret so confessedly and evidently important. And even Sir John's joking intelligence must have had some weight. But indeed, while Eleanor remained so well assured within herself of being really beloved by Edward, it required no other consideration of probabilities to make it natural that Lucy should be jealous, and that she was so, her very confidence was a proof. What other reason for the disclosure of the affair could there be but that Eleanor... Okay, let's try that again. What other reason for the disclosure of the affair could there be but that Eleanor might be informed of it of Lucy's superior claims? What other reason for the disclosure of the affair could there be but that Eleanor might be informed by it of Lucy's superior claims on Edward, and be taught to avoid him in future? She had little difficulty in understanding thus much of her rival's intentions, and while she was firmly resolved to act by her as every principle of honour and honesty directed, to combat her own affection for Edward, and to see him as little as possible, she could not deny herself the comfort of endeavouring to convince Lucy that her heart was unwounded. And as she could now have nothing more painful to hear on the subject than had already been told, she did not mistrust her own ability of going through a repetition of particulars with composure. From the others, and though they met at least every other evening either at the park or cottage, and chiefly at the former, they could not be supposed to meet for the sake of conversation. Such a thought would never enter either Sir John or Lady sufficiently noisy. One or two meetings of this kind had taken place, and called at the cottage one morning to beg in the name of charity that they would all dine with Lady Middleton that day, as he was obliged to attend the club at Exeter, and she would otherwise be quite alone, except for her mother and the two Miss Steeles. Eleanor, who foresaw a fairer for the point she had in view, in such a party as this was likely to be, more at liberty among Marianne, though always unwilling to join any of their parties, was persuaded by her mother, who could not bear to have her seclude herself from any chance of amusement, to go likewise. The young ladies went, and Lady Middleton was happily preserved from the frightful solitude which had threatened her. The insipidity of the meeting was exactly such as Eleanor had expected. It produced not one novelty of thought or expression, and nothing could be less interesting than the whole of their discourse, both in the dining parlour and drawing-room. To the latter the children accompanied them, and while they remained there, she was too well convinced of the impossibility of engaging Lucy's attention to attempt it. They quitted it only with the removal of the tea-things. The card-table was then placed, and Eleanor began to wonder at herself for having ever entertained a hope of finding time for conversation. Lucy directly drew her work-table near her, and reseated herself with an alacrity and cheerfulness which seemed to infer that she could taste no greater delight than in making a filigree basket for a spoilt child. Farther ceremony, she turned away and walked to the instrument, said Eleanor, endeavouring to smooth away the offence. The remaining 5 were now to draw their cards, said Lady Middleton to Eleanor. Eleanor joyfully profited by the first of these proposals, and thus, by a little of that address which Marianne could never condescend to practice, gained her own end, and pleased Lady Middleton at the same time. Lucy made room for her with ready attention, and the 2 fair rivals were thus seated side by side at the same table, and, with the utmost harmony, engaged in forwarding the same work. The pianoforte at which Marianne, wrapped up in her own music and her own thoughts, had by this time forgotten that anybody was in the room besides herself, was luckily so near them that Miss Dashwood now judged she might safely, under the shelter of its noise, introduce the interesting subject, without any risk of being heard at the card. 54 seconds, gosh, okay. All right, and save. 23. Why it keeps doing this, it's very annoying. It's not my camera, I have repeatedly tested that. It's got to be the internet connection somehow, but don't know. I do have a good internet connection, but yes, it occasionally faults out in the streaming. All right. Whoops, clang. All right, 24. Chapter 24. In a firm, though cautious tone, Eleanor thus began. And Eleanor spoke it with the truest sincerity, replied Lucy, her little sharp eyes full of meaning. Lucy here looked up, but Eleanor was careful in guarding her countenance from every expression that could give her words a suspicious tendency. Thought Eleanor. Continued Miss Dashwood after a short silence. Lucy looked at Eleanor again and was silent. Repeated Miss Steele, whose ear had caught those words by a sudden pause in Marianne's music. A mutual silence took place for some time. Lucy first put an end to it by saying in a lower tone, though Marianne was then giving them the powerful protection of a very magnificent concerto. They were again silent for many minutes, blushed for the insincerity of Edward's future wife, and replied, said Lucy, with some pique, and laying a particular stress on those words. Eleanor thought it wisest to make no answer to this, lest they might provoke each other to an unsuitable increase of ease and unreserve, and was even partly determined never to mention the subject again. Another pause, therefore, of many minutes' duration succeeded this speech, and Lucy was still the first to end it. Said she, with all her customary complacency. Returned the other, while her eyes brightened at the end, to which both of them submitted without any reluctance, for nothing had been said on either side to make them dislike each other less than they had done before, and Eleanor sat down to the card table with the melancholy persuasion that Edward was not only without affection for the person who was to be his wife, but that he had not even the chance of being tolerably happy in marriage, which sincere affection on her side would have given, for self-interest alone could induce a woman to keep a man to an engagement of which she seemed so thoroughly aware that he was weary. From this time, the subject was never revived by Eleanor, and when entered on by Lucy, who seldom missed an opportunity of indulgence which Lucy did not deserve, and which were dangerous to herself. The visit of the Miss Steeles at Barton Park was lengthened far beyond what the first invitation implied. Their favour increased. They could not be spared. Sir John would and to assist in the due celebration of that festival, which requires a more than ordinary share of private balls and large dinners. Woohoo! I don't get to do that very often, but it's fairly short ones. 4 minutes 30. Actually quite long, there's a lot of dialogue in it, so I only get to do my bits. 4:30. It's an odd rattling there, I don't know what it is, it only comes every now and then. Do not like it. Okay, backing up. All right, 25. Chapter 25. Though Mrs. Jennings was in the habit of spending a large portion of the year at the houses of her children and friends, she was not without a settled habitation of her own. Since the death of her husband, who had traded with success in a less elegant part of the town, she had resided every winter in a house in one of the streets near Portman Square. Towards this home she began on the approach of January to turn her thoughts, and thither she one day abruptly, and very unexpectedly by them, asked the elder Mrs. Dashwood to accompany her. Eleanor, without observing the varying complexion of her sister, and the animated look which spoke no indifference to the plan, immediately gave a grateful but absolute denial for both. Denial not deniable. To accompany her. Eleanor, without observing the varying complexion of her sister, and the animated look which spoke no indifference to the plan, immediately gave a grateful but absolute denial for both, in which she believed herself to be speaking their united inclinations. The reason alleged was their determined resolution of not leaving their mother at that time of the year. Mrs. Jennings received the refusal with some surprise, and repeated her invitation immediately, understood her sister, and saw to what indifference to almost everything else she was carried by her eagerness to be with Willoughby again, made no farther direct opposition to the plan, and merely referred it to her mother's decision, from whom, however, she scarcely expected to receive any support in her endeavour to prevent a visit, which she could not approve of for Marianne, and which on her own account she had particular reasons to avoid. Whatever Marianne was desirous of, her mother would be eager to promote. She could not expect to influence the latter to cautiousness of conduct in an affair respecting which she had... I just had my timing all wrong there. Let's try it again. To avoid. Whatever Marianne was desirous of, her mother would be eager to promote. She could not expect to influence the latter to cautiousness of conduct in an affair respecting which she had never been able to inspire her with distrust, and she dared not explain the motive of her own disinclination for going to London. That Marianne, fastidious as she was, thoroughly acquainted with Mrs. Jennings' manners, and invariably disgusted by them, should overlook every inconvenience of that kind, should disregard whatever must be. For going to London. That Marianne, fastidious as she was, thoroughly acquainted by Mrs. Jennings, with Mrs. Jennings, Claire, that Marianne, fastidious as she was, thoroughly acquainted with Mrs. Jennings' manners and invariably disgusted by them, should overlook every inconvenience of that kind, should disregard whatever must be most wounding to her irritable feelings in her pursuit of one object, was such a proof, so strong, so full, of the importance of that object to her, as Eleanor, in spite of all that had passed, was not prepared to witness. On being informed of the invitation, Mrs. Dashwood, persuaded that such an excursion would be productive of much amusement. On being informed of the invitation, Mrs. Dashwood, persuaded that such an excursion would be productive of much amusement to both her daughters, and perceiving through all her affectionate attention to herself how much the heart of Marianne was in it, would not hear of their declining the offer upon her account, insisted on their both accepting it directly, and then began to foresee, with her usual cheerfulness, a variety of advantages. Okay. No, I'm going to go back to the beginning of the sentence. It was a long one too. On being informed of the invitation, Mrs. Dashwood, persuaded that such an excursion would be productive of much amusement to both her daughters, and perceiving through all her affectionate attention to herself how much the heart of Marianne was in it, would not hear of their declining the offer upon her account, insisted on their both accepting it directly, and then began to foresee, with her usual cheerfulness, a variety of advantages that would accrue to them all from this separation. Marianne's countenance sunk. Eleanor could not help smiling at this display of indifference towards the manners of a person to whom she had often had difficulty in persuading Marianne. No. What's that? Okay. It's the stand I've got my webcam on. For some reason, it's doing a tiny little vibrate. Okay, I think that's fixed it. Eleanor could not help smiling at this display of indifference towards the manners of a person to whom she had often had difficulty in persuading Marianne to behave with tolerable politeness, and resolved within herself that if her sister persisted in going, she would go likewise, as she did not think it proper that Marianne should be left to the sole guidance of her own judgment, or that Mrs. Jennings should be abandoned to the mercy of Marianne for all the comfort of her domestic hours. To this determination she was the more easily reconciled by recollecting that Edward Ferrars— what was that crack? Okay. Domestic hours. To this determination she was the more easily reconciled by recollecting that Edward Ferrars, by Lucy's account, was not to be in town before February, and that their visit, without any unreasonable abridgment, might be previously finished. Eleanor had often wished for an opportunity of attempting to weaken her mother's dependence on the attachment of Edward and herself, that the shock might be less when the— No, my timing's off there. Try it again. Eleanor had often wished for an opportunity of attempting to weaken her mother's dependence on the attachment of Edward and herself, that the shock might be less when the whole truth were revealed, as calmly as she could. Mrs. Dashwood smiled and said nothing. Marianne lifted up her eyes in astonishment, and Eleanor conjectured that she might as well have held her tongue. After very little farther discourse, it was finally settled that the invitation should be fully accepted. Mrs. Jennings received the information with a great deal of joy and many assurances of kindness and care, nor was it a matter of pleasure merely to her. Sir John was delighted, for to a man whose proviling? I don't know what proviling means. Pleasure merely to her. Sir John was delighted, for to a man whose prevailing anxiety was the dread of being alone, the acquisition of two to the number of inhabitants in London was something. Even Lady Middleton took the trouble of being delighted, which was putting herself rather out of her way, and as for the Miss Steeles, especially Lucy, they had never been so happy in their lives as this intelligence made them. Eleanor submitted to the arrangement which counteracted her wishes with less reluctance than she had expected to feel. With regard to herself, it was now a matter of unconcern whether she went to town or not, and when she saw her mother so thoroughly pleased with the plan, and her sister exhilarated by it in look, voice, and manner, restored to all her usual animation, and elevated to more than her usual gaiety, she could not be dissatisfied with the cause, and would hardly allow herself to distrust the consequence. Marianne's joy was almost a degree beyond happiness, so great was the perturbation of her spirits, and her impatience to be gone. Her unwillingness to quit her mother was her only restorative to calmness, and at the moment of parting, her grief on that score was excessive. Her mother's affliction was hardly less, and Eleanor was the only one of the three who seemed to consider the separation as anything short of eternal. Their departure took place in the first week in January. The middle followed in about a week. The Miss Steeles kept their station at the park, and were to quit it only with the rest of the family. Okay, and that's that one. Oh, stomach. Noisy lad, stomach. Sometimes. Okay, and pick it up. Done. 6:30. Okay. Okay, I'm going to try and get one more chapter, and then I'll probably have to have a break because my stomach is burbling, but I'll come back after that. How long is this? Oh, actually, no, it's a really long chapter. No, there's no way I'm going to get through that without repeated stomach burbles. So I'm going to cut the live stream here, and I'll probably come back in half an hour or so.